As many of you will already know, Dr. Gregg Henriques is a professor of graduate psychology at James Madison University, and he received his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of Vermont and did his postdoctoral training at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's primarily here because he's a theoretical psychologist who has developed the unified theory of knowledge, which is a conciliant scientific humanistic worldview to unify psychology. And so I thought, as a part of me introducing you to our friends who have gathered here today, I thought I'll do something really silly, which is something that I often do for me to try and understand what we're getting ourselves into. So
I warn everybody about that, so we're starting off in the right place.
So in my own way, I thought I will present to you what I think you have created in a very simplistic way, just to set the context. And then obviously you will get more deeper into that. So in the way, and I just watched some of your videos, I did a little bit of reading, and so I'm sort of plucking things out of you in some ways to try and explain in my own way. So let me do this. All right. So
I like it already.
Yes. So one day you wake up and you're like, excuse me, psychology, we have a problem. And then psychology goes, what is it? What is it? And you say, the problem of psychology is that there is no agreement regarding what is meant by the domain of behavior and mental processes, or behavior and mind. In other words, how wild is it that psychology has no clearly identified subject matter that it examines and wants to practice?
Correct.
So the lack of agreement stems from the various meanings that have been given to this idea of the mental. Some would say that the mind equals self-conscious reflection and rationality. And then there are others who would say the mind is the subjective conscious experience. Yet another group would say that the mind equals neurocognitive computational processes of the nervous system. And there's yet another group that will say, from the tradition of behaviorism, that the mind means behavior.
Lovely.
And so the lack of a coherent conceptual shared agreement means that the field of psychology is a puddle of fragmented chaos, which does not help us cultivate wisdom. So what is the source of this confusion? It's the enlightenment gap, stupid. So the conceptual.
I'm having you do all my slides from now on, Molly. This is good. This is very.
So the conceptual confusions that have confounded psychology for over a century really stem from an enlightenment gap, this lack of a coherent philosophical framework that affords a clear understanding of the proper relations between A, matter and mind, and B, what is scientific knowledge and social knowledge. So we obviously think about René Descartes when we come to this. A lot of us will realize 300 something years ago, I don't know if he has ever really managed to sleep well, given how much we are still talking about this dude. So the enlightenment gap can be seen in the so-called mind-body split, the mind-body problem in science and philosophy. We can also see it in our current times in the deep-seated debates, conflicts, and confusions between modern and postmodern positions regarding the nature and place of scientific knowledge in relation to social context and power dynamics. So in order to solve this problem of psychology, and in order to resolve the enlightenment gap, comes Dr. Gregg Henriques, and you create something called the Unified Theory of Knowledge, UTOK, which is comprised of 8 key ideas. And I'm not going to get into the 8 key ideas here, but I'm just going to briefly say that the first is the Tree of Knowledge system. Very cool. Justification systems theory. I really love this. I hope you will talk a little bit about it because it's so applicable, and it's like you immediately begin to see that in ourselves, in application all the time. The behavioral investment theory, which is the third idea, very cool again. And then the influence matrix also, I really love this as well. And then on the other side of the tree, we have the character adaptation systems theory, the character wheel of development, the nested model of well-being, and then this is an acronym called COM, M-O. So these form the 8 key ideas. And within the 8 key ideas, Dr. Gregg Henriques is also working on 3 core projects. The first of the core projects is that the ideas 1 through 4 form the unified theory of psychology. And back in the day, around 2011, you were focusing on the level of meta theory in order to integrate the key insights of the major perspectives. And I wondered if this is major perspectives of psychology that you meant through these the first 4 ideas. Now you are focusing on developing, you're framing it a little bit differently now, where you're focusing on developing a proper descriptive metaphysical system that affords a clear ontology of the mental, which then should be the primary way of defining what psychology is, which then affords a radically new way to approach scientific psychology. Now, I don't always know what you meant by scientific psychology, and sometimes psychological science. So it doesn't matter. We can get into that. The second core project is the other side of the tree, ideas 5 through 8, which form a unified approach to psychotherapy. So this is more getting into application. And then your third projects, all of it put together, is to resolve the enlightenment gap through the affordance of a new metaphysical and synthetic philosophy via the unified theory of knowledge. So I will stop with that. How did I do?
Absolutely fantastic. It's wonderful. It's really, yeah, so that's a real honor and a pleasure. That was crisp and clear, at least as far as I was concerned. And so it affords us, I mean, I have millions of possible slides that we can go in. I wasn't sure. I kind of wanted to see where people were first. I am a clinician first and foremost, so I like to check in on people's narratives. I know this is a practice orientation. So I wasn't sure exactly. I have lots of possible avenues and I want to check with the group. And then you gave me this wonderful opportunity to lay out the basic architecture in an engaging and what I thought was clear way. And so, yeah, absolutely. You really captured the story. I'd be happy to give a little bit more narrative context for it. But fundamentally, UTOK can be framed in relationship to a new way to think about our knowledge systems, orienting towards our modernist knowledge systems. And we can talk about what I mean by that. Specifically, the modern empirical natural science justification system is what I would call it, a knowledge system, a way to justify what we understand. So modern empirical natural science in a nutshell refers to the Galileo, Descartes, Newton, into Einstein way of seeing the world that gave rise to, I think, arguably pretty coherent, although certainly a lot of debate, what's dark energy, I'm sure you hear certain kinds of things, but a pretty coherent map of what matter in motion. And then that got tied to biology. And then we tried to jam psychology inside of it. That's what becomes modern scientific psychology, is trying to jam psychology inside of the modern empirical natural science way of thinking. And that never gets resolved. That is, back in 1899, psychologists are noting what they call the crisis of our discipline, 1899. And I'm just renaming the crisis the problem. So the crisis has essentially always been known. I'm not making anything that's new at the level of pointing things out. I'm framing it slightly differently, and I'm trying to get the audience of scientific psychology to appreciate this problem again. They appreciated it for a long time, and then they gave up on it, and then they decided it wasn't a problem, and they rationalized their identity, and we can talk about how, and moved forward. And I think that was ultimately a pretty problematic way of being. And so, yeah, so I'm reframing it. And then I'm a clinical and theoretical psychologist, so I'm really interested in what's our theory of scientific psychology about humans. I want to make a very important point that scientific psychology should be first and foremost about animals in general, okay? And then human psychology is a different branch of psychology. This is a very important point I make. And so we can talk about what that is. So human psychological science should give us a picture of the human condition, what it's like to be, why there are individual differences, how do we get socialized into our modern cultures. It should give us a description and explanation framework for that. And then psychotherapy should apply those ideas of describing and explaining to the various psychological adaptation systems. And they should teach us as psychological doctors to see processes of psychological adaptation in people, help them understand, become aware, and cultivate more adaptive living toward valued states of being and flourishing, and minimize psychological disorder and suffering. So that creates this idea we should have psychological doctors grounded in the science of human psychology in a way that's pretty parallel to we have medical doctors that are grounded in science of a science of human biology. That just makes sense in biology, but it doesn't make sense in psychology. And the short answer is because nobody knows what the F psychology is. It's like, hey, unlike biology, we don't know what we mean by psychology. So I think that's my project is falling into that. And then as I fell into that and fixed some of the problems, at least from my vantage point, then all of a sudden what springs forth, interestingly, is a whole new way to organize our natural sciences, our social sciences, and our humanities in a way that's profoundly more coherent, integrated, and also very pluralistic. I want to be very clear. I'm not like, oh, everyone's got to do the same thing, or now there's one way of understanding the world. No, it's actually, we now have a clue about how all these pluralistic parts can go together with a coherent, integrated pluralism. Notice the word integrated there is very integral-like, and there's a huge amount of overlap with integral. I have some minor differences with integral, and we can talk about those. But I think we're at the cusp of a transformation, or at least my little world is trying to argue we're at a cusp of a translation. I don't know if the universities or whatever people care about that, but I care about it, and I'm trying to share that.
Yeah, that's awesome, Greg. So for those of us who are in the integral world, just from what you just even presented, I think it's very, some of our minds just work like kind of start clicking into quadrants and stages and all that. So already it was very interesting to see just the fact that with the biological sciences or medicine, as you said, sometimes those are the outer exterior quadrants, and there's very little dispute, or it's hard to argue with the exterior quadrants just at a simplistic level. But boy, psychology, or when you get into the sort of the interior quadrants, it's super difficult to come into consensus or come into agreement in many ways. And so this is all really helpful. And also just listening to you, whenever I have seen you on YouTube, talking with other people, I also just wonder, how wonderful it would have been if we could have got Ken Wilber and you to be talking together. And I still hope that perhaps that could happen someday. I imagine many years ago, before there were podcasts, Ken used to love getting together with others like you, and used to have amazing discussions. And it's unfortunate that really for the last 10-12 years or so, his health has really gotten in the way of him really being able to do that. But I still keep hoping that there might be an opportunity, because I think it'll be a wild conversation.
I think it would be.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I'll offer just a few quick thoughts on that. So I've been inside the academy my whole life. And just for people probably will appreciate this, I was sort of blinded about Ken's work as a function of being inside the academy. And for my 2003 paper, the Tree of Knowledge System, Theoretical Unification of Psychology, when I first lay it out, I don't cite Ken at all because I didn't know about Ken in 2003. 6 months later, somebody emailed me and was like, hey, this guy Ken Wilber's got, working on integral stuff, and it looks, kind of big picture similar. And I was like, huh? And then I'll be honest, back in the day, I may not have been as reflective. I was like, oh, this guy's not doing real science. So, I had a bit of a scientific edge to me and a bit of an inside academy of elitism. And now I'm totally outside the academy going, oh my God. So I look back on a lot of that and a little bit of embarrassment and humility, but that was my initial reaction. And then over the years, most notably, thanks to my deep friend, Andre Marquis. I don't know if anybody knows Andre Marquis here, but Andre Marquis connected deeply to Ken Wilber, and he's a counseling psychologist, psychotherapist, brilliant individual who built remarkable bridges between Ken Wilber's work in the world of psychotherapy, specifically the world of psychotherapy integration. I'm actually the president of the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration currently. So this is a home of mine. Andre and I hooked up and in 2007, and ever since we were like, and he was then taught me how to see the world of psychotherapy through the Wilberian lens. And it was in that context that I really started to appreciate what Ken had to offer. Really understood the lines and levels and stages, and in particular, the quadrants, loved the quadrants, and loved the East-West bridge. And then later, so I'm inside the academy going, oh, I want to solve a theoretical problem in psychology and bridge it to practice and organize research. That's what I feel like I'm doing. And I get a little notoriety in small little pockets, but the field actually doesn't care about what I'm doing. And I don't mean that like with an edge. It's not really thinking in terms of the way I'm arguing. And an argument without really institutional backing, I learned that doesn't really do much. Oh, that's interesting. Next, it's like, so that was. But I just kept pursuing my ideas, and I got weirder and weirder in terms of as I went further and further down my rabbit hole. And so while I was inside the academy up until 2016, I then jumped out of the academy with a thing behind me called the garden, which is this representation then of my system of knowledge. And that's when I really sort of go full orbit out. And when I got full orbit out and really seeing the need for a synthetic vision that for philosophy across the divisions, then I even more appreciated what Ken was trying to do, and more deeply appreciated both the bridges to East that he did and the way in which modern empirical natural science became a dominant epistemological frame for the world and really injured the humanities in many ways, or at least the inability to see the whole was deeply problematic. And Ken's framing on that picture, Ken's work on bridging the East and Western, his awareness of the mystical tradition and the beauty and brilliance of the quadrants were really very meaningful for me. So I certainly see UTOK as a kindred spirit to integral in a big way. I'm involved in many communities now that don't think these things have to be completely pitted against each other. We advocate for a coherent, integrated pluralism, so you can aspectualize different features of the world while still dancing together around a particular center. I think UTOK and integral do that well. There are some differences. I am anchored to a more naturalistic, scientific vision in some ways, ultimately. And we can talk some about those. But I really want to speak here to also, first and foremost, an enormous amount of congruence, an enormous amount of complementarity that I see and that I didn't always see, frankly, in terms of my original training and embeddedness in the culture of the academy, sort of the academy proper, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just take a quick moment here, Greg, to thank you for that, by the way. I want to just quickly introduce you to Dr. Suzanne Greuter here, who is as well, just to say that she's been with us a long time as well. And like you, she has the agreements and the disagreements with integral, and we love that. We really just welcome that. Dr. Suzanne Greuter, Dr. Jane Lovinger, and some of these names you might even know, they studied really the ego development and the stages. And so just wanted to mention that we have someone who might meet you at that academic scholarly level here. I am the least smartest here when I look around. So I really
Okay.
shouldn't be the one leading this.
Well, you
Also,
did a brilliant job. I really appreciated the opening. Seriously.
okay, well, thank you. So how about I just let you, I definitely want you to talk about perhaps the four first key ideas, perhaps. And obviously we only have, this is a 90-minute session and we've already kind of taken about 25 minutes. And I would love to have time for Q&A
Right.
as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. The other thing that I did bring,
Sure,
and
yes.
now I'm not sure that it's sort of, I think I was worried it was a little too long and rich anyway. So I'll share a PowerPoint that I developed. Okay. And what I chose actually to focus on in that case was just a backdrop on the tree of knowledge. On the one side, to kind of get a framework for what I call my descriptive metaphysics, which basically is how you define matter and mind. Like, so like, what's our fundamental frames for that? And then I went all the way other side of the tree and I talked about COM-MO because I know it's practice oriented, and develop some thoughts on that. However, what I can share that as just a PowerPoint, given the engagement and the time, trying to get through that, I think now is not optimal. And let me just then engage. I'll pull up just the 4 slides that represent each one of the 4 key ideas if you let me share my screen. And I'll start with just give you a snapshot. Okay. I'll just give you then a snapshot. Okay.
Yeah. So, anything that brings you joy and delight to share with us, Greg. So yeah, absolutely.
Lovely. Okay. Well, this works very well. So what I'm going to show you is the left-hand side of the tree. And by the way, she did a wonderful representation of the tree. This thing behind me is the tree of life. Okay. Which is and the first branch on it is the tree of knowledge. Okay. In many world mythic traditions, you have 2 trees. There's sort of a horizontal tree of the natural world. That's going to be the tree of knowledge. And then the tree of life is a vertical tree that grounds you in the pre to up through the conscious into the transcendent. Okay. To give a Ken Wilber frame of pre and trans to create a vertical. The tree of life is the symbol of communing with self, of nature, of living wisely, and ultimately getting in right relation to what I call the concept of God. Okay, so that's the tree of life. It sits inside of a garden. And of course, that's another pretty clear metaphor. I believe in what's called the garden fractal. The garden fractal is if each of us can cultivate our lives wisely within the sphere of influence that we have, we'll be able to create a macroscopic garden, which is something that, in my opinion, we desperately need in relationship to honoring Mother Earth and transforming our relationship to nature, shifting our relationship to technology, evolving our relationships with each other in a way that is now feeling increasingly, well, shall we say, unhealthy in across all those different domains. So that's sort of the garden metaphor context. It's designed to build our logos of science, the logic of science, and the way science organizes our knowledge systems in a new way. And by that, I do mean the modern empirical natural science that I refer to for. So if I say science, there's yogic science traditions or a lot of other science traditions. By shorthand for science, really the proper term is modern empirical natural science from Galileo to Newton Einstein. And it's a particular kind of knowledge system. I believe a lot in that knowledge system, but it's totally incomplete. Okay. And it was broken, and its breakdowns are super apparent in my field of psychology. Okay? So I then fell into a rabbit hole along those lines, and then built an architecture. So now what you're seeing here, okay, everybody can see that this slide. Okay. So now what I fell into then, the first idea that I had becomes what's called justification systems theory. You can see this on the screen. This was before I had this picture. Okay. And justification systems theory, maybe actually I'll start even there. The justification idea, as I'll call it in sort of easy terms, is this. So I got concerned with what is psychology. I was being trained, and this is in 1995 into 1996, give you the kind of time frame. I'm being trained in cognitive psychotherapy, behavioral psychotherapy. I'm being trained in Freudian psychotherapy. I'm well trained in social psychology and cognitive psychology, which is different than cognitive psychotherapy. But I'm well trained in these areas. I'm trained in feminist psychology. And then I get involved in evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychology was up and coming at this time. We psychologists in the 1980s were not trained very much in evolutionary theory. And that turned out to be a really big surprise to me once I learned about evolutionary theory and the science of biology, which we desperately needed more knowledge of. So anyway, what's the justification idea is an idea that helps explain and organize what it is that caused us to go from primates, great apes that are pretty similar 5 million years ago to the rest of the world, to even being pretty similar 1 million years ago. So that then by 300,000 years ago, where we can probably identify the earliest Homo sapiens sapiens, maybe there's debate about that. But certainly by the last 100,000 years, which in geological time is not that big, we see an unbelievable change, so much in one ape's story that radically alters the planet, so much so that we now call it the Anthropocene. And so you go from a behaving animal that's hanging around with the rest of animals to then jump into what I would call a whole new plane of existence, okay, what I specifically call the culture person plane. And if you ask the question, well, why? All right, you're going to get 4 general answers. Most people will give 4 kind of answers to this question, okay? One answer is language, okay? And I want to be clear, everyone knows that other animals communicate, okay? And I would argue other animals even have symbolic communication. Some animals have symbolic, dolphins, some have symbolic communication, some aspects of chimps, okay? But a pretty strong argument can be made that only humans have what's called symbolic, syntactical, open communication systems, okay? Which are basically networks of propositions that we share and engage and question. Okay? So language is one, self-conscious reflection and reasoning is another. The evolution of our cultural learning seems different. There's a cumulative nature to our culture. So language, self-conscious reflection, the cumulative nature of culture, and then finally our technology. And of course, we now know that we're not the only creature to make tools, but if we add a little qualifier, do we make complex tools that evolve? If we ask, does any other animal make complex tools that evolve? You can pretty quickly say, no other animals really, at least systematically, engage in the evolution of technology. We humans are engaged in the evolution of technology, okay? So these 4 answers, there's certainly others, and then there are questions as to why. Well, I take the first 3 answers, evolution, propositional language, self-conscious justification, and cumulative culture, and I tied them together with a single idea in 1996. And this is the justification idea, okay? So the justification idea is this. That is, it's the idea that there had to have been a tipping point in cognitive communicative networks, okay, the way we think, talk, and relate to each other, when we went from just symbols pointing stuff out into propositions that are meaning-making statements that claim a positive truth. I'll say that again. Propositions that are meaning-making statements that claim a positive truth. So there's their antelope, okay? You have a symbol that indicates an index, you have a noun referencing a thing in the world, and you and I can sync up an intuitive, and humans, there's really good evidence, as apes, we're really good at syncing up our intention and attention, and almost certainly before we had language, this is one of our really good capacities. So I get what you mean, okay, when you say their antelope. But when you shift it to there are the antelope as a proposition, notice their antelope's not a proposition. You can infer, but you can't make a factual, definitive meaning-making statement out of it. When you do say there are the antelope, you've now made a positive claim of the world. And this positive claim now opens up a whole set of interesting dynamics, which can be encapsulated by the word question. Okay. With a proposition, you can question the dynamic claim and create a dynamic, meaning there are the antelope. And you can say, no, those aren't antelope, those are llama. Or they're not over there, they're over here. Okay. So there's a factual state of affairs to a proposition. That's what a proposition, a meaning-making statement about the state of affairs, that now you can question in a counterfactual way. And the other thing that it opens up is it opens up, should we be attending to this meaning-making? Now that it's there, should we be doing this? Notice there's a fact-based element and then a value-based element. Okay. And I then divide the value-based into, well, it's valuable for me. If I'm bringing this propositional network to you, it's going to have a particular value for me. And then the question is, what's the connection to me as a personal level? And then what's the connection to the social level? Okay, meaning like, is it good for us to be paying attention to there are the antelope right now when we could be singing songs about sunsets or any number of possibilities? Okay, so the idea of the justification idea is propositions hits a tipping point. This opens up the negative space around the positive space of the statement. And then we have cognitive gadgets called questions, who, what, when, why, where, that then engage the dynamic of the proposition into a question answer justification dynamic, okay, where we now need to decide together what is the case and what ought to be the case for me and for whatever social network then is tied together in this particular conversation relating to this particular set of claims. Okay. All right, so I'll pause there and see if that makes sense. Okay, see if there are any particular questions. So, okay. So now here's the cool thing about this, all right? What this does is it takes the first three sets of ideas about what makes us unique and now ties them together in a tight little bow. It says language tips to proposition, and you can explain the evolution of language in this particular way. So it takes that sort of as a given, but then it grabs self-consciousness and culture, the cumulative evolution of culture, and says that we should be able to see self-consciousness and culture through this lens of adapting to the problem of justification. Okay. And what it means then is that the culture portion of our society, and by that I mean capital C culture, by the way, culture is a complicated word. I'm taking a part of culture, specifically propositional networks of beliefs and values, yoked together to build systems that coordinate people on what is and ought to be. And these can be labeled justification systems. Okay. And what the justification systems are social constructions legitimizing cooperative competitive power flow in the world, basically. Okay. Like what is and what ought to be. My first intellectual awakening was with feminism. Okay. 1980s, late 80s, 90s. All right. Early 90s. And I wake up to the whole problem of, hey, a lot of our normative structures seem to be made by white men for white men, okay? And we're taught that these things just are the way they are, but actually behind that structure is a normative biasing mechanism that's legitimizing power flows towards the people that have power and create the broadcast function. In other words, people are creating systems that sound like they're rational and reasonable, but actually they support a particular kind of structure, a particular kind of normative structure. The postmodern critique of modernity is that what are claimed to be these pristine rational systems are essentially embedded justification systems that serve to legitimize power. Okay. So I'm suggesting to you, if we zoom up and see the culture level, many, many critics have said what passes for knowledge is really embedded in a system of justification. So this lens affords me in that regard. The other thing that it does, now I'm not a sociologist, I'm a psychologist, okay? So I'm interested not in what's the context that this conversation takes place, but what's this conversation? and how am I as a human being relating to Nomali and everybody else? And what are my clients coming to me with? And how do I understand human consciousness? Okay, and the dynamics of human consciousness in relation. What the justification idea said at the human level is it immediately highlights the idea that there are going to be three big domains of consciousness for us humans. Okay, One domain of this consciousness is your felt subjective experience of being in the world, which we've labeled here on the diagram in front of you, your experiential self. Okay, this is the most generic description for it. Okay, I often refer to it as your primate self. Okay, the primate self is your felt experience of subjectively being in the world. Okay, you can divide this further into a couple of different parts. One easy division is you have a witness function. Many meditators will orient themselves to the witness function. You also have a self-grabbing function that's like, hey, I like this, I don't like this, this is relevant to me, this should care about, okay? And the primate portion of your core self does that with feeling. Hey, this makes me feel good about myself, this makes me feel secure, I feel loved. All of that is intuitive, affective, what my friend John Vervaeke calls perspectival, emotionally grounded perspectival knowledge, okay? And this is what we share with our primate relatives and all the way down to dogs. And then we can get into what animal consciousness might look like as we go to ants and things like that. But for now, we can say at the primate level, you have a perceptual system, and then you have this affective system, okay? And then I'll take a question in a second, just after I do these other two. So then there's a, on top of that, it's the private self, okay? That is essentially your I ego, whereby it's the part of your self-conscious system that's looking at the experiential self and developing a narrative of what it is and why, okay? So this is going to be akin to the ego largely, although Freud was slippery on the way he defined his terms. But the I-me relation can be thought of as the ego looking on the experiential self and narrating in a back and forth sort of way. So you then, justification idea says, oh, well, now we need to build narratives that are explaining why, what we're doing, and engage in the world through propositional networks. And you notice I'm pointing to my left hemisphere here. Okay, the left hemisphere is heavy in this kind of processing. And then the final argument is that, well, wait a minute, we have to navigate what other people are going to see to us. And this is your persona or your public self most descriptively. But in terms of when you're feeling it, it's a persona. Okay, it's a persona. So I'll give you an example of the persona. It's the persona is when you feel or at least what makes it salient, when you feel self-conscious that you might be judged. Okay, so I just got home from the store. I thought I had plenty of time, but every once in a while, my computer freezes and then it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to reboot. So I sat down at 11:40 today and I saw, oh no, my computer's in that mode. Okay, so then I know I've got 15 minutes to sit here and hopefully that's going to be on time just by 11:55. My experience of being self-conscious then, what are these people going to think of me? How's this going to go? Gosh, this environment technology stuff is so frustrating. I then just watch my entire felt sense of self-consciousness, feel the potential judgment of my failing to meet an obligation, and then feeling, loss of influence and reputation or whatever. Of course, as a psychotherapist, I can also hold metacognitively all of that and be like, oh, look at us humans. Okay. But the point of it is that you can immediately then see a persona trying to justify yourself on the social stage, an ego that's trying to narrate what's going on as it sees what only it can see from the inside. And then you have your primate self, it's perceiving and feeling about the world in a particular way. So I'll pause there. That's your experiential self, your private self. I guess the last thing I'll say, it's called the updated tripartite model. For anybody that knows anything about Freud, it's the id, ego, superego was his tripartite model. Each of these, the experiential self, the private self, the public self, relate deeply to the id, ego, superego kind of formulation, although it's a different, it's certainly, it's a layer that takes some of his stuff and then shifts some of his stuff. So I call it the updated tripartite model. So I'll stop there with this idea of justification and take questions and pull this off the screen. I saw at least one hand went up. I think it's
Yep, I think Sasan had a question. Yeah. Go ahead, Sasan.
I was just wondering whether you had the slides for this. I was furiously taking notes. And if you had a slide with the 3 parts of how you see the self or the... Oh.
Yeah,
and then that would have helped. I could have listened more deeply and taken less time trying to write. Sorry.
No, that's totally fine. Yeah, no, I didn't. I do have slides like that, and I will share those.
It's okay. For that one, I have the notes.
Okay. All right.
And it's crucial to my theory. So
Great. Well, I'm happy to see, like I said, I was debating what aspects might be of most interest to the group, and I didn't start here, but I'm happy to at least upload that. I have access to that. I've been working on that one since 1996.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other kind of questions, Nomali or anybody else, kind of for that particular idea?
Anyone? Any questions? Thus up to here? Any amount of examples that you can give? Like I love that you use the example of sort of getting late in traffic.
Right.
Just any little stories
Sure.
like that, I think will be continuously helpful for us. Yeah.
I'll give you one other classic story I tell in the context of understanding the model. Is that when I was, a kid, this is late 1980s as a teenager, when I'm 10, I don't really notice the girls. And by the time I'm 14, that's pretty much all I'm thinking about. Okay. So I go through that normal biological adolescent shift, as I did with my other friends. And those of us that sort of went through that, we're all get, oh, she's attractive and, do what little boys do. But I had a friend who was lukewarm about that whole process. Okay. Yeah, I guess she's kind of cute. Okay. You may be able to get a sense where this is going, but from 15 to 18, he went through an unfolding where it dawned on him that his experiential self, his libido and orientation in the world was towards other men. Okay. Why did I took, as soon as my hormones shifted, I went from, I don't really have much interest to, oh my gosh, that's what I want. And there was no problem with that other than I need to regulate it, a little bit. But he lived in a homophobic world. His dad would have been very judgmental of this kind of thing. Okay. The justification system in the late 1980s was not such that it was okay for your average 15-year-old where I lived to say, oh yeah, well, I like guys. Okay. That would have been like, we wouldn't have been intense about it, but it would have immediately cost him in reputation. And, we used the F word and things like that back then. Okay. So you have this whole context of justification, which he then internalizes, which then creates this dynamic relationship between his animal self and what it's oriented to. As it sheds light on its energy, it comes, I use the old Polaroid analogy here, okay? The Polaroid analogy for psychological defenses is that you take an old Polaroid and it comes out gray, right? And then after about 30 seconds or so, that gray image starts to become colorful, like back in the day, right? And you take a picture that way. Well, I use your subconscious energies can be like that. Like that is, it jolts an image, and as it becomes clear, there's a part of you that's engaged in signal anxiety. It says, oh no, I don't want to see that. Okay. It will feel the anxiety and then it will avoid that. Okay. So that my friend would have had lots of charges, okay, towards a particular sexual energy that were unacceptable. So he just would have shifted his attention. Finally, he comes out to himself. And what that means is he goes out from the experiential system into the egoic narrator that then becomes self-consciously identifying as, oh, that is what I am, after a long period of repression. Okay. Then it wasn't until he's at college that he comes out to his family. Okay. So he comes out to the ego, and then he has to navigate, what is this going to mean to my dad? And my family, and who am I gonna, and what kind of family am I gonna have, and how are they gonna think about me going around? So finally, I'm gonna create a context where, mom, dad, I got something to tell you. I'm gonna come out of the closet. So the closet then is that persona to ego. So we can see in our everyday language, we can totally relate to this. Oh, you have something private, you have something you don't even tell yourself, and then you finally tell yourself, and then you wait to tell other people, and you finally tell other people. Well, that's just a everyday grounded example of the filtering process between our primate self and our person ego, and then our person ego and a persona on the social stage. And I would argue that from a clinical psychologist, I'm seeing these iterative dynamics all the time in relationship to the structure. So that's another example. I call the second one the Rogerian filter often, which is, if you know anything about psychotherapy, I say all good therapy starts with Carl Rogers. Okay. What did Carl Rogers say? It's the judgments of others, okay, that isolate and alienate your organismic valuing process from your primate self. okay, and then create this inauthentic disconnect. And so the therapist needs to, with empathy, positive regard, create a relational context where the individual can authentically and with congruence say what they really are. So in other words, pull the Rogerian filter down and be real about this thing, okay? And so central to humanistic client-centered therapy is this whole idea that the way in which we navigate our persona relative to our organismic valuing process is absolutely central. This psychotherapeutic enterprise, fundamentally from a Rogerian perspective, is essentially managing that filter and fostering the opportunity for congruent growth across your experiential, egoic, and persona domains.
Excellent. Thank you. I see Dragpa's hand is up. Go ahead, Dragpa.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Henriques. I know I'm totally new to your work. I'm really excited by the treasure trove that you've offered for years now. But I'm right at the beginning of this. And I feel like I'm perhaps going to jump ahead of the story a little bit, but I also know the time together is a little brief window here. So I wondered, in terms of your justification systems, so I know you posit this digital plane or kind of a next kind of emergence. So, and you're kind of actively wondering too, with others, about what might be some of the threads of a justification system that can handle all these individuals. And we have these three tripartite layers, then in groups, but then throw in a meaning crisis, some culture wars, sense making, incoherence, and all this. So what threads have you seen in terms of emergent kind of justification systems that I know you orient around dignity and well-being and also integrity? What threads are you actively kind of cutting edge for you playing with in terms of what you might anticipate as being important aspects of kind of an emerging justification system?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. Actually, I'll go ahead and share my screen and go to the first slide, which is the tree of knowledge, okay? And I'll give a little bit of background to that, and then I'll come back to your question, because the tree of knowledge will set us up for my approach to this question. And it will also then give folks an opportunity to see that key idea, which is really important. So I'm going to share my screen here and just go back, okay? So when I talk about so there are lots of big problems that we're facing, okay? I see it in this corner of the internet. If you hang out, you'll hear the word meta crises, okay? This goes to Dragpa's basic question. Meta crises are the intersection of lots of different problems that are really difficult to solve, and they're all networked together, okay? So one is the way we treat the environment. It's pretty clear to me to be a problem, okay? Not an unsustainable relationship there. And another is the digital world, for good reasons, and I'll come back to this point in a little bit. Digital world is going to change us dramatically, okay, in the 21st century, okay, the argument will be. But one of the things that I'm really concerned about is our knowledge systems, okay? And this gets to the enlightenment gap. So when you go to the academy, okay, for higher education, and I would actually say when we structure our K through 12 education into the academy, what is the knowledge architecture that guides our understanding of what we know, okay? And the reactor is just content-based, like, well, you need to know the language arts and you need to know the sciences. And I'm like, well, what is the understanding of the world, okay, that's available to us? And there is none, okay? And in some ways there shouldn't be. That's a dangerous thing. But I would argue that actually there's an opportunity for us to achieve a much clearer understanding of the world for the academic knowledge systems that we have, link them together so that many more of us can have an optimal grip, use a John Vervaeke term, on our self-world relations that is both congruent with what science tells us and our subjective lives, okay? Because I think science has a lot to offer, but I think, and psychology is horrible at this, but the entire scientific discipline is horrible at giving us a framework for understanding the world that is congruent with your life, okay? So here's what I want to do with this, okay? I want everybody take a moment. Let's get centered in our meditative space, okay? We're practitioners here, right? Okay. And I'm going to stay with the logos here rather than drop into a meditative perspectival frame. So let's go with the logos. Everybody just notice, hey, you're being pulled to the earth, right? You can notice yourself being pulled to the earth. Okay. You're an object that takes up mass on the plane of space-time. Okay. 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension at a time. You're an object. All right. And we can analyze you in terms of a massive object around other massive objects. And then we can analyze your chemistry from the very, very basic particles, okay, like an electron, up to the atoms, like a carbon atom, into a protein. Okay? And we can then have a vocabulary for you as a material object. All right. Well, that's your object matter plane of existence. I'm a material object. Okay. Now let's go and say, well, yeah, I'm also alive. Okay. I'm also alive. So I'm not just a material object, but I'm a living organism. And then I'm at the logos level. What does that mean? Well, it means I have cells and genes at a sort of a pretty fundamental level. Okay. And then those cells collect into organ systems. All right. And they have a relationship to create a whole organism that's metabolizing, that's responding, that's growing. Okay. Dying. All right. And so I'm a living organism. So now I'm a material object. I'm a living organism. I'm also an animal. And that's not the same thing. It's a higher order. I'm an animal that can move around in this environment on a sensory motor loop. So not only am I living, I'm what I call minded. I'm minded. This is a word we have destroyed. Other cultures have this word. It's what you use to refer, more or less, what refers to the differences that animals are in the world relative to plants. And now plants do all sorts of remarkable things, but animals get up and move around on a sensory motor loop. And that's what I call mindedness. Okay. It is from that mindedness that gives rise to by the way, that's mind one. And then mind one gives rise to mind two, which is this super weird thing that I actually have an experience of being in the world, like I feel pleasure and pain, so I can intersect with my body. I also have images and more higher order emotions and desires, so I can feel hungry. I can also hope that this presentation goes well, or hope UTOK makes a difference on the back half of the 21st century. Now, how do I do that? Well, I do that by both my imagery, that happens at my primate level, animal, notice I'm an animal, I'm a mammal, primate, and then I talk to myself, and I talk to others, and I went to school to learn language, learn mathematics, learn reasoning, and learn how people have justified stuff for a very long time, and I downloaded that, and I got access to the history of justification in the sociocultural context that I was in, and so now I'm a talking person being. So just look at yourself and be like, hey, I'm a material object. I'm a living organism. I'm a minded animal. I'm a cultured person. And ask, does that seem reasonable from the inside? Okay. And I would argue it's not only reasonable from the inside, but it also corresponds directly to what we know from the outside. Okay. Like we can really place you. And indeed, before the matter object happens, there's actually one layer beneath that called the energy information layer. Okay. So you're really an energy information, matter object, living organism, minded animal, cultured person arrangement. All right. Now, in working with UTOK, one of the things that I am doing with embodied practice is some of us have built a theory of the week. Okay. The theory of the week starts on Monday, is the void day. This is before the energy information. It's just pure, it represents pure darkness. So Monday is void darkness day. Okay. And then Tuesday is energy information day. So we think about physics, we think about the core of the universe, we think about Big Bang and quantum theory. Okay. And then Wednesday is matter object day. And we study chemistry, geology. Okay. And then Thursday's biology, that's life organism day. Friday's minded animal day. Saturday is culture person day. And then Sunday's called God Moon Day, which is we think about the myth of the world and its potential and what we are striving towards. And then we start all over again on void darkness. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is, why isn't this is known, and more or less, this is a very conservative articulation, but it's nobody's organizing this in a particular way. And by the way, it is the case that I gained some insights to enable me to see this, but there is a way for this to become known. That what they have in front of you is a new map of big history. Big history is a movement that basically says, hey, we can understand the evolution of the universe on the dimensions of time by complexity. You have to know what you mean by complexity. The tree of knowledge gives us the right way to frame complexity in this particular problem, i.e. our own evolutionary complexity. And it has these novel insights that you can then say, hey, matter, life, mind, and culture represent 4 planes of existence. And we can specify the way those planes of existence evolved. And we can specify the relationship of continuity and, by the way, discontinuity, and now get much clearer then on a holistic picture of the universe, our place in it, both, to use a Wilberian frame, inside and out. So to me, why the fact that we're missing this in our educational systems, given how much craziness there is, it'd be like, why is it, where is this, is from the inside, at least from my vantage point. The last thing I'll say to get to the kind of the point, because I know about going on, I had to give this background, I want to get the slide, is really quickly, this happened to me in literally at a flash of insight in some other slide. Actually, the one I have was going to share the original tree of knowledge. This pops out of me. I'm stoned in 1997 in Vermont one night. I've been working on this whole justification idea. And then literally this architecture fell out of me in a stone moment. I drew it out. There's no, it looks very similar to this. It's quite remarkable, I would argue. Okay, it's like, how the hell did I, quote unquote, remember that? Know that, and without just knowing, it's weird. But once I generated this, a big question that I have is, what the hell are these actual cones, to use a Ken term? What's the vision logic really representing? Okay, that took me a little while to crack, okay, and really to get right over quite a few years to get really right. But the short answer is at least after we get to matter, life is a kind of information processing communication network that is very different than matter, you can argue, okay? So you get DNA and the way in which RNA, DNA, and proteins work, you can argue that the core of it is like an information processing machine that's organizing energy, information flow, and then cells, they network and communicate to each other. And they do that in a way that's very different than things at the material level. So a very reasonable argument, what makes life so different? Oh, it's a network of information processing communication. Okay. Well, we ask, the way I'm defining mind here, it's a very similar thing. Whereas the cells and genes are pulling together, here the nervous system is pulling all the cells together to create an information processing system that allows it to behave as a whole and then communicate with other animals as a whole. Okay, that's mindedness. And then look what we do, justify, okay, and symbolic language. So what they say is, well, when you get an information processing system, okay, that networks things into communication networks, and you have a totally different mode of information interface, that could be a game changer. That's what it says. It's like, okay, now that opens up new possibility space in a really crazy way. And you get the difference between a plant and an animal and a person, okay? Well, now you look at the world. So if you have this map, once you see that, so this is me in late 1998, really. And then you're like, okay, well, I can count 1, 2, 3, what would be the 4th dimension following matter to make it the 5th dimension overall. And then the question is there any emergent information processing communication network that is giving rise to, that we're seeing in the 20th century? And the answer was, oh my God, I mean, we built artificial intelligence systems, we built an internet, we built computers. We're now going to see, the argument is the 21st century then is where all this is going to get networked, and we're going to open up the digital plane where we're interfacing now with technology, and our entire intelligence cybernetic systems are now engaged in unbelievably different kinds of interface. So just one of the dynamics we face, according to this, is that the digital world is going to open up a huge number of potentials. That's great. It's also going to create an enormous amount of chaos. The reason we'll take a lot of chaos is because now there's all these new potentials that the old system was not set up. It just presumed that you wouldn't be having people jump together on a Zoom from everywhere around the world and be able to talk as though the space-time continuum just collapsed. It just presumes that that's not what's happening, but now it can happen. And so there's an enormous amount of assumptions that are built into our old societies that now are going to be transformed. And there are a lot of other things going on. But so one of the bottom lines is that this says that, this culture thing, which has been really organized by systems of justification and technologies that were separate, like my hammer is certainly important, but my hammer and I don't talk to each other. Well, now my cell phone and I do talk to each other. Okay. Now that's a game changer. And so the 21st century is going to see the emergence of a digital landscape. There's lots of reasons to believe that the digital landscape is going to be different. Some people think that, oh, well, let's just jump to the digital landscape. We'll do transhumans. Okay. And we'll download our consciousness and live in dis for the rest of our life. I am very suspicious of that. I think that's deeply misguided. I think that fails to appreciate what we need is a wisdom stack across all these different layers. And we need a wisdom knowledge system to guide the iterative development of technology. And I see the entire UTOK frame and the various aspects of it to afford us a knowledge into wisdom system that can play a role in the ways in which we evolve our technologies. So I'll stop there because I want to try to get the tree of knowledge in there, get a frame for it. I see Phyllis has her hand up. I'll happy to bring this back up if we want, but I'll jump back into this conversation.
Thank you so much. And prior to knowing that you were coming today, I've been listening to some of your talks, and I just find you completely fascinating, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
A couple of questions. One is, I was just struck by when you were talking about the tree of knowledge, and you were talking about, you start off in darkness, and then the next move is toward energy. That narrative that you gave sounded extremely like Genesis, and you're calling you're calling this the tree of knowledge. So there's that obvious, kind of crossover. And so I was just wondering, but I'd like to get to the second question also. But one of the things that I'd like to hear what you have to say is how the scientific community responds to this sort of like underlying spiritual aspect to your work, which is something, by the way, that I really appreciate. But I'm wondering how that fits into the scientific community. The second question, though, is that you're also talking a lot in the way that you're explaining things about how communication changes from step to step to step, and when you combine it all into this justification model, then you're really, it sounds to me that you're relying tremendously on language and on propositional knowledge at that point, and on communication as being the sort of operative thing that's moving things forward. And I'm wondering, I know that you go back to Piaget and you go back to the sensory motor, language learning, but at what point do you think that language stops being the emergent thing and begins to be the overarching thing that is defining, what you're doing? And isn't that what Vervaeke is talking about in the meaning crisis, that we've gotten so stuck in the propositional that the parts that, underlie it are being lost in the translation?
100%. So yeah, let me, a couple of different things then. So taking your second part first, and then I'll come back to the first part because it's actually related. Okay. So yes, I'm grabbing a hold hard on this issue of justification and honing and affording ourselves awareness of it. Okay. And that is one of the things that when I wasn't necessarily bringing that to this group, but since I did, go out and see yourself as a justifying ape. Okay. And you're going to find that you do a lot of that. Okay. And by the way, I don't mean justifying just like rationalizing in the Freudian sense. I simply mean asking questions, trying to generate answers, seeing what's okay. Justification is a dimension that goes all the way from defensive rationalizing on the one hand to the central problem of epistemology, like refined knowing. It's justification. Okay. So this dimension is not just, oh, he's talking about rationalizing. Yes. And I'm talking about what philosophers get together and they try to decide what justified true belief is in the old definition of epistemology. So the first thing is, A, this is a big dimension. I'm grabbing it with this concept of justification. It's going with him. It's central, but it's not everything. Okay. And both modernists with their hyper rationality and quite frankly, postmodernists with their emphasis on language social construction, both of them get themselves hooked into the propositional. What I did was I'm getting there through the justification idea, and then you flip out with the tree of knowledge and you're like, oh, justification is one dimension of complexification or plane of existence embedded in mind, embedded in life, embedded in nature, inside an ecological system. Okay. So what the tree of knowledge actually is, and then Ken would appreciate this at a pre-trans level. So what do we mean pre-trans? Well, you want to go under a consciousness, and then you want to transcend the egoic justifying consciousness. Okay, and realize then that isn't everything. In fact, the entire Eastern tradition can be argued to basically like get out of your the Tao Te Ching. I'm going to tell you what it is, but this ain't it, because it isn't about justification. It's about being. Okay. Well, the West way overshot on justification. Ian McGilchrist and John Vervaeke are making this point. And we way overshot on rationalizing reason-based knowing. As I can tell you, as a early cognitive psychotherapist, I way overshot on the power of getting your thoughts straight. I was like, what the hell's the body doing? Pay attention to the body, okay? And the felt experience of being in the world. So John and I, there's almost no difference as far as I can tell, although we climbed up the mountains in different ways. I'm a very close colleague with John Vervaeke. I've done many things with him. In all of our conversations, there may be a hair's breadth of difference in some aspects. We are both in 100% agreement that a holistic education system should not just be propositionally based, and you cannot engage in deductive foundationalist logic to determine the right way of living. Okay. No offense, but basically people on the ASD spectrum try to do that some, okay? And they're oriented in a particular way, and then neurodiversity dynamics, but whatever. The point of it is that the human being is a primate, embedded, embodied system, okay? And if it's going to live healthily, it's got to have that entire matter, life, mind, culture, tech stack, and it has to be in good communication across the stack. So when I'm doing psychotherapy, okay, I'm listening to a person's story. Of course, that's the justification. And then I'm watching them, and then I'm tracking my primate heart, feeling them. Okay, it's like, what is it like to be in that body? Okay, is it loose? Is it dynamic? Or is it, well, I don't really know why I'm here today. I don't have much to talk about. It's like, I think we probably got stuff to talk about, but you just don't know how. All right, okay. So you basically, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I'm just saying that like, that's what my felt sense would be like, oh, there's a lot to talk about. Okay. If you're there in the body that way, that justification system is like back up and doesn't know what it's doing with its loins or its guts, okay, or its relational world. So we definitely need a stacked system to understand, and we need our perspectival, procedural, participatory, in particular, perspectival, participatory knowing. And to John's language should go to Ian McGilchrist. I don't agree with everything he says about left and right hemisphere, but it's pretty good. Definitely lots of powerful insights, and we absolutely need a more holistic, systemic vision. That's why I love Ken's stuff. We left and lost a dynamic, living, holistic, philosophical system that embraces the arts, relationship to the science, embraces how we live in the world, and on and on. So then the final piece then ultimately is that because we can get holistic knowledge, if you have the right element, we can do a much better job to bridge our scientific knowing to the wisdom of the ages. Okay. I learned, and there's some truth to this, but I grew up in a Dawkins-esque atheistic household where my dad was an evangelical Billy Christian born again, who who lived in his young adult years that life and then grew into the ideas, actually, that's a lot of BS. It's like, it was transformative for me, but the propositional claims of rationality, actually, I don't believe anymore. And then then God's not real. And then that's what God, you have a specific propositional claim about God is real from the theism, and then atheism, God's not real. And then everybody's in the debate and it's like, oh yeah, God's kind of like Santa Claus, he's not real. And then you grow, at least I grew, at least in this way of framing it. That's not really the right way to frame God, right? It's like it's relating to the concept of God, and many, many religious traditions have created that particular kind of relation. And when you tell me, hey, one of my credos is I believe in the concept of God, okay? And what do I mean by that? It's first off, fasten your seatbelt. I'm very radical. People believe in God, and that has consequences. Okay, so that's amazing. That's crazy. I am an empiricist, so I was like, oh, okay. But when I then say believe in it, it's like that's got potentially powerful good things to it. I'm not a Sam Harris where it's like, well, it's all crap and all damaging. I think that's unbelievably problematic. And they're absolutely different. So what I want to do is I want to take the wisdom of orienting toward the transcendent without necessarily making ontological claims that we know what that transcendent is, but we can orient toward the transcendent. And with that is an orienting light, okay, toward good, true, beautiful, toward that which is justifiable. And then I did an analysis of justify, and one of my sayings is be that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity. I could talk about that. That's my orienting toward God also, okay? So if you then say, oh, what are these things metaphorically, and what do they speak to in terms of deep human needs at the I level, and deeper maybe needs at the we collective mythopoetic narrative level? Holy God, they say all sorts of things. I learned quite a bit from Jordan Peterson's Bible series, by the way, on that. I'm going to plug for that, although I certainly am a critic of Peterson in many ways, but that was a beautiful series. So I want us to appreciate, unlike me, we've given basically the question, you believe in a literal interpretation of scripture, or you believe in Dawkins' atheism. I think both of those are the wrong either or. And I believe we can evolve into a much more sophisticated, holistic, in some ways integral picture.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Thank you.
Happy. That's a wonderful question.
Sorry, I still have questions about, well, how do you orient? Because there's a stack, and the different aspects of the stack orient in different ways. They make meaning in different ways. They make sense in different ways, different value arcs. In spiral dynamics, for example, to try to get to the point, like, are there certain meta heuristics or certain evolving functions that attune a system so the overall health of the stack is more thoroughly cared for with greater span, depth, directionality, inclusion? So this orienting, integral,
yep,
more comprehensive, more whole kind of approach. Have you found, like, what are the threads, or what are the orienting features that don't then become oppressive structures to subparts of the stack, but the integrative ones?
Exactly. I mean, there are a number of ways to go on that. So let me, since I did plan on talking about this, let me go down into the psychotherapeutic angle on you for the stack in relationship to the individual level, because there's collective stacks for us at the cultural level, like the nation state level. There's collective stacks at the globe level, and then there's more family into individual level. So if you do a socio-ecological analysis, it depends on the level you want to be talking about. Although ultimately the UTOK system does believe in the garden fractal, and there are principles that are invariant across these levels, okay, that I think you can find. But let me talk a little bit about what I found in the world of psychotherapy and why I believe that there's a common core of psychotherapy that's available to us that also sets the stage for all sorts of different divergent opinions, of course, and lots of different possible practices. But nonetheless, the theme of my presidency was toward a common core of psychotherapy. The one common core is crystal clear. That's called the relationship. Okay. Okay. In psychotherapy, you're vulnerable. You're not sure. You got to go. You got to trust somebody. That's true of virtually all healing professors, but it's particularly true of psychotherapy. You need safety. You need trust. We know that if you don't have that, you're doomed. Some people say that's basically all we do is provide a good relationship. That's a little strong. But in my estimation, what we do in my estimation, particularly well, what's particularly well for psychotherapy is what are called the internalizing disorders, okay? Which are disorders, I will say, of a vertical stack nature within the person. I'll explain that, but just to go back to your point, it's a disorder. Notice the term internalizing, okay? So an internalizing disorder is the term that we clinical psychologists use, and this is getting more and more for what they used to call neurotic disorders. I'm actually trying to bring that back, okay? It's the class of disorders that are anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, difficulty coping, interpersonal conflict, and reactivity. Anybody heard of any of those problems before? Okay. They're 60 to 80% of what come into the psychotherapy world, okay? There is an underlying architecture, in my estimation, that virtually all systems of psychotherapy see in regards to this process, all right? They see them in different levels and in different ways, but here is the fundamental architecture of this issue. And you can be specified in what I call a triple negative neurotic loop. Okay? Loop is going to be a maladaptive cycle. Triple negative is going to say, hey, there are three chains to this looping function. Okay? And I can send this, I do have slides on this that's in there, and I can direct you. So first, what's the negative? Negative situations. Okay? Negative situations, shit happens. Pardon my French, shit happens, okay? Your status, your love, your reputation, your ability to have mastery and control in the environment gets hit, okay? Poseidon throws you a curveball, and all of a sudden your world sort of blows up in terms of the way you want it to be, and now you have that. And then your primate system responds to that with negative feelings, okay? So the second loop then is you feel negatively about it, all right? Negative situation elicits a negative feeling. Then you have an ego, okay? Your primate responds. Then you have an ego that's managing yourself on the persona level. And here is a third negative, okay? Where you get a secondary reaction to the feeling and situation, because it's your thinking to the system, and you're like, shit, I hate this, okay? I hate this situation and I hate this feeling. And then what you do is you get energized to either run away from it, avoid, okay, in some way. I'm going to blame either myself or others as a way to try to bring justice to this issue. And then I'm going to try to control it so that it never happens again. Okay. These are the ABCs, okay, of the third negative. All right. And there are other ways that people do it, but if you look, almost always. Now, the analogy I bring here is that this is like bringing water to a grease fire. Okay. It makes sense to avoid blame and control. And certainly there are many times I do that and it can be fine. But there are many times, and just like it makes sense to bring waters to many fires. Okay. If you're in a forest, put water on it. If you're on a stove, be careful. Okay. These are stove situations. And the way in which the ego then is trying to put out this fire through avoiding, repressing, okay, I don't really care about men, okay, or blaming, what the fuck is wrong with me, or controlling, I'll just never be sexual in any way. I'm obviously referring back to my friend trying to control their sexual impulses. But whatever the impulses are, you're going to see this broad sense of defense, of coping, of secondary reactivity, okay? And that often takes the form of an interject, an internalized voice that is trying to grab the internalized system, and it has a critic mindset, which is like it's critical and closed. It's resisting what's going on. It's irritable. Okay. It's tense. It's insistent. Okay? And fundamentally, it's basically closed at the level of hope in the future. So it's hopeless. Right. So you get this critic, avoiding, blame, and control mindset. All right. And fundamentally, the vast majority of the root of maladaptive relations is in these vicious cycles between the ego, past and current injuries of situation, and feeling states, okay, that then get layered into very, very complicated self-relational worlds and other relational world dynamics. So what do we do about this? Well, fundamentally, the psychotherapeutic process, okay, is about shifting your defensive reactivity, okay, and then turning into a responsive, psychologically mindful holding environment. So I can go on with that, but I see you have a hand up there.
Definitely, in terms of the internal architecture of the individual, I mean, it's such a layered question that requires such a layered response that you're offering. And to some degree, it's kind of the $1 million question for integralists. Like, how are we going to orient this coherence in a way that doesn't oppress any part of the stack?
Right.
So you're handling one part of that stack now,
right.
Which is great.
So the triple negative neurotic loop. In fact, I have a mythopoetic architecture called the Dragon's Lair for this, where basically you're pulled into a cave of behavioral shutdown on this chain and have an identity relationship problems. Okay. And what we want to do then, what I do is I love the person. Okay. You bring the person in. All right. This happens to a lot of people. We're dignified creatures. Okay. I want to recognize your suffering. And then I want to hand you both in a relational environment. I want to model this. And then I want to, I'm to come from the CBT tradition. I actually do, like many people say, gosh, you do like psychodynamic stuff with a CBT flavor. It's like, yeah, well, I kind of do that. Okay. So there's a psychodynamics of the way you're defending against these feelings, what your underlying motives are. I think a lot about your primate, desires for sex and aggression. Okay. But then what I want to do is I want to then teach you to say, hey, slow down, become mindfully aware instead of mindlessly reactive. Okay. And then to do that, this is COM-MO. This is the little black thing on the tree of life, the last little piece, which is the most active intervention practical part. COM-MO says, hey, first thing, we have to become aware. Metacognitive awareness. Okay. Observer, metacognitive observer, your MO is a metacognitive observer that sits from being in as a subject in the stream. So you do a subject-object shift. Anybody knows Keegan knows that do subject-object change. So now all of a sudden, what was my subject becomes the object of my observation. This takes a little talent, but most people have egoic capacities as adults that can do this. I can now see myself as if I were somebody else. Okay. So the metacognitive observer, then what do we want to do with that? There's the acronym CALM, which of course is the word. All right. So if you're bringing water to a grease fire, the best thing to do is just stop because you're making things worse. Don't do anything. All right. But anyway, bring CALM relative to a defensive anxiety. And then inside CALM, you unpack that to get an acronym, which is C is curiosity. Okay. You want to bring a curiosity, openness, awe, wonder. Where am I and what is happening to me? Okay. A stands for acceptance versus resistance. Okay. Buddhist was like pain times resistance. It's like, well, the world is, and being in it with the capacity to engage in distress tolerance is a deep and powerful concept of acceptance. There's so many layers of that. L stands for loving compassion. If we go to a Christian archetype, agape. John Vervaeke talk about a lot about agape. How do I hold the world with love? How do I hold myself and other people with loving compassion? Of course, it's a Buddhist concept, deep. All the wisdom traditions are big on loving compassion, basically. And then M stands for motivated toward valued states of being in the short and long term. Okay. So then what you do is you're, okay, what are my values short term? What are my ultimate values? How am I going to be a good ancestor? That's one good way. What are my eulogy values? These are the arcs of their long-term values. And then how am I going to take this network of pluralistic competing structures, get them to get along to maximize my adaptive response in the short and long part of a long term? Okay. If anybody knows anything about ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, they're going to recognize a lot of overlap with CALM. CALM has a lot of overlap with ACT. But fundamentally, what I teach people in the psychotherapy room, in addition to engaging in their real lives as real individuals and me as a real person, rather than some psychological doctor doing a patient who has a disorder, it's like we're people first and foremost. But I do understand the engineering dynamics of the internalizing conditions. I help people see them. I help people stop bringing the ABCs or water to a grease fire. And I help people replace that by shining a COM-MO flashlight on that outer ring. And that affords them the capacity to listen to their heart and see the world as for what it is and get in right relationship to that. And then also be oriented to adaptively regulate that so they're in right relation to what ought to be based on what their values are. And if you get in right relation to is and ought, well, that'd be a good thing.
Okay, great. First of all, I know we have come to our 90-minute mark. Greg, do you have a hard stop right now, or
It's Saturday, normally, so
okay,
I'm
awesome. So I realize some of you may need to leave, and if you do, thank you so much for joining. If you do need to leave, I wanted to ask you, Greg, so when I look at something like integral, I look at integral sometimes as or oftentimes really as an excellent psychotechnology for sense making. You can like use it as a tool, and it's very helpful with many, many ways in which we can use that. So I'm wondering, there's a couple of us here who are also in a John Vervaeke study group, and we're sort of making our way through the meaning crisis videos, and we're pretty close to the end of it. One of the questions that I wonder if you can help us with or help me with is, how would you use UTOK as a psychotechnology or a sense-making tool, in the sense that, let's say there is a current hot topic.
Right.
For example, let's just say extreme postmodern views hijacking academic institutions, like they're coming for you.
Never heard of such a thing.
Right? Yeah. The hyper-partisanship, or just the sort of...
That actually happened to me in my program, by the way. That literally.
Okay, I'm not surprised.
I was identified as a conservative old white guy. So, I was like, okay, in the academy, I'm now a conservative old white man with power. So
yes, yes.
Happen.
So if we look at anything really that you feel is a sort of a culture war issue, or an issue of the hyper objects, or a meaning crisis, something, can you use a current thing that is up, and how would UTOK help us in grasping more sense making around that, and that could lead to action also then?
Totally. I'll tie that together with a direct example. So John Vervaeke and I engaged in a Voices with Vervaeke conversation with Rachel Hayden, who is a transgendered woman. And Rachel Hayden was trying to make sense out of both her experience as somebody who transitioned / transitioning, depending on how you define that term, but certainly now fully identifies as a woman, and then lives in a space where to talk about trans issues in some ways very quickly turns into a very hotbed of moralizing dynamics that are very, very sensitive, and then can explode the system. And quite frankly, much of that has been captured by what I would certainly identify as a mean green machine from a Wilberian. Love the post-Trump analysis that Wilber offered. So what are the beauty of UTOK is coming at this from the two big, kind of notions, psychology back into science. So there's a logos dimension. And then there's the psychotherapeutic phrenesis dimension of like, well, how do we get ourselves into a place that is most likely to be responding wisely and adaptively in particular contexts? So you can certainly enter, if you have a problem, you can go the one route of like, okay, at least at the psychotherapy level, there's a lot of guidance here to create psychotechnologies that create healing context for complicated issues. That's psychotherapies can be like that. It's got a lot of, so the COM-MO really creates a very, very explicit framework for that. But the logos issue is really key as well. And we have to understand what we know rather than just what we morally feel must be the case. And the transgender issue is a great example of this. Okay. So what happened to the transgender issue? I'll give you a little story about this. So, this past year, right at the New Year's Eve, my family and I went for a family reunion. And lo and behold, the transgender issues emerged. There was a swimmer, a transgendered woman swimmer, who is now breaking all sorts of records, and had been, identified as a male and identified as a female. Now was an average male swimmer, to make the short, I don't know the enormous amount of details, but this is essentially it. And then she was crushing records as a woman. And members of my generation, my brothers and others were like, yeah, that's kind of unfair. I'm wondering if we're pushing this stuff too far. And then the college educated, especially led by one very bright, just about ready to graduate individual, sits in a pretty leftist activist sense, was helping educate the system, okay, on the fact that actually there are two fundamental things we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of sex, okay, which is your physiology, all right? And then there's gender, which is a socially constructed role system, all right, that legitimizes identity of male and female. And people are confused about that. And sex has some anchor in the world, and it certainly means that women can get pregnant and men can't. But virtually all of what we identify as men and women comes completely from the social constructed roles that we are learned, what UTOK would immediately identify as your justification system, okay? And the nature of the justification system, just like I learned with feminism, is oriented to cisgendered hetero people, and thus individuals in the binary classes have been marginalized. It is time for us to completely overthrow this system of justification because it is fundamentally illegitimate, because it creates unfairness to certain people. And it's time for us to do away with any rigid gender roles. And we can, because they're all basically arbitrarily socially constructed. Okay? Wrong. Okay, if you understand UTOK at its very basic level, what you're seeing is my discipline very often has framed human behavior as a function of nature and nurture. We hear the Enlightenment gap. There are material things in the world, your genes and cells, and then there are ideas, that's mental, these two different vectors all the time. And many people have taken this idea that sex is just the biological layer, and then gender is the socially role constructed layer. That's wrong. You're missing the entire layer of primate mindedness. Okay, where's primate mindedness live? It's not biology, folks. Okay, and this is a mistake. Now, our disciplines, basically the science of ethology is a biological difference. That's the science of animal behavior. But animal behavior, properly construed, was originally studied by comparative psychologists, and all animal behavior, especially with animals with brains and complex active bodies, and what they do in the world should be seen as minded. Okay, it doesn't reduce to physiology and genes. What are they? They're patterns of behavioral investment. Okay, patterns of behavioral investment. Then you ask, we should go ask a primatologist, do different male and female categories in primatology matter in terms of the behavioral investment patterns of primates? I mean, primates, what? In fact, Franz de Waal, the primatologist, just released the book Gender, a study of differences from a primatologist, because they're completely different. Okay. By the way, not only are they so different, but it's super interesting. There are examples of what appear to be essentially transgendered great apes, whereby you have a biologic female that hangs out and does the dominant aggressive stuff with males and pumps on their chest, and they're fine with that. But the roles are so clear that they can identify an individual jumping from one role to another. The parental care is completely different. The sex relations are different. If you look at bonobos, which are sort of a kind of chimpanzee, they used to think of them, they're different kind of great ape. They're matriarchal, okay? They organize through tight-knit relationships of connection, which, by the way, is solidified by brief acts of lesbian sex, if you want to call it that, okay? To maintain, and they create a dominant structure over the males. Chimps are very different. Chimp males are, very many of them, aggressive, dominant creatures that beat the crap out of others and maintain control through an archetypally masculine way. Wait a minute, what am a masculine chimp? Yeah, actually, folks, okay? So you can see patterns of investment in primates. They do not have systems of justification, okay? They have masculine and feminine behavioral investment tendencies that should be recognized, okay? And then once you recognize them, you actually then go back to the original trans issue and you're like, well, actually, what the heck, in an archetypal structure, what is trans? What is the depiction of trans? Okay, trans is somebody who's born into one kind of body. So Rachel, okay, Rachel's born into a male body. people see a penis and label him male and give you a gendered role. Now, folks, if all of our behavior were caused both by your biophysiological architecture and the social role, i.e. your sex and gender, there would never be any ambiguity. You simply would be the creature that had the sex, architecture, and the role. People feel differently, okay? They feel like they identify with a different masculine or feminine energy relative to the experience. This is the classic, I'm in the wrong body. How do they do that? Because they pick up on the fact that we have different masculine and feminine mindedness potentials, okay? And I can explain more about what those are, but all you need to do is look at the tree of knowledge and be like, we're missing a whole category in the basic vector. It's biopsychosocial, folks. It's not nature nurture. It's biopsych or life, mindedness, and culture, better. Life, mindedness, and culture. And these are the three vectors. So what my young nephew should have said is actually there are three different things. There's the biophysiology of the organism. There's the behavioral and passing patterns of primates, which, by the way, are gendered. Not all animals are, but primates tend to be. Okay. And there's the socio-constructed roles. Three things, not two. That our system is educating out of, he's an award-winning Chapel Hill student in anthropology and philosophy, okay, is getting educated that they're just two vectors, is just diagnostic of what we're just walking around with half a clue. And then we're throwing people into intense political, hyper-political structures that now have primed individuals to morally commit because they're so important, and we know the moral right answers, that they become moralizers. And then you get a nightmare moralizing system that's advocating justice over anything else, grounded in something that's fundamentally errant. Well, that's the road to hell paved to good intentions.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that. I just want to ask if anyone else has any questions.
What you just said brought me back to something that I have heard you speak about with Vervaeke, and I kind of have like loose thoughts about it. So I hope that I can articulate it in a way that it makes some kind of sense. When you're talking about these, you and Vervaeke talk about, sort of like heuristic knowledge, and that consciousness that's unconscious, the unconscious consciousness. Sure. And you have a bit of a difference with him in terms of procedural knowledge and where you place it in his 4 Ps. And when I heard that, I started to think about reflexive behavior, and how that seems to be left out of the equation, and how perhaps there's a something between some correlation between reflexive behavior, which really comes before participatory behavior. It's sort of, if you're going to look at Piaget, it starts with reflexive and then moves to participatory. And there's a difference between that reflexive and procedural, but maybe there's also a correlation between reflexive and this other third rail that you're speaking about. That there's a kind of unconscious consciousness that is giving us information that that we don't put into the equation in traditional academic, places, and that maybe if we thought a little bit more about this relationship between reflexive behavior and unconscious consciousness, that maybe there's a place for that in the conversation.
Right. So a couple of things there. Yeah. So John and I worked hard to get synced up on this. And I think we did. You have to understand what he's trying to do and what I was trying to do, because we come from different things. We're grabbing hold of different aspects of a form. So I'll just comment on procedural knowledge. So he's coming at it in relationship to our forms of knowing, okay, and then enabling us to become more pluralistic in our forms of knowing and get out of our propositional knowing and recognize that we have these other forms. And of course, he's really emphasizing participatory And perspectival is the kind of knowing we want to embrace. But procedural knowing is a particular kind of knowing where you get skill-based power. Okay. Now, John has noted, and often did, that these things are actually embedded in different cognitive mental systems, okay, meaning procedural knowledge, okay, is literally a memory system that is stored differently than your perspectival knowledge, okay? It's literally stored in your non-declarative procedural system, okay? Now, the non-declarative procedural system, how does that work? It absolutely, in many ways, you could argue, connects to the deeper reflex system, okay? What happens, what you do, when you learn a procedure, what you end up doing then, when it becomes rote, is what happened is that you created a muscle memory that chains together essentially stimulus response reflexes, okay? And then when you are chaining together direct stimulus response reflexes to get your skill outcome, tie your shoes, and you have chained them together automatically, you lose conscious awareness. You obviously are seeing your shoelaces, okay? And at some level, you're feeling them. If you broke all sensory input, we would obviously not be able to do it. But the sensory motor chaining system is essentially bringing your reflexive system online to a chain to create a procedural action system, okay? Indeed, the root of that is what are called fixed action patterns in animals. These are the closest things to procedural learned instincts that you know how to do automatically when you are born. Like root, the rooting reflex can be also a procedural knowledge that's embedded as a fixed action pattern for the infant. The pattern, if it's ready, as soon as it gets a particular stimulus, it will start to pull its mouth together in a particular way to get it placed on the breast, okay? That's all procedural knowledge that are reflexively chained together, all right? Now, at that level, at the embeddedness structure and the relationship to consciousness, procedural knowledge is pointing to one aspect of our cognitive structure. It relates very much to what I call mind one, okay, what Nomali was talking about. Outside of your conscious experience, that relationship is complicated. John is using it in a broader cognitive to know sense, and he's making a comment about our educational systems. So when you're making a comment about our educational systems, procedural knowing in this context is like, well, yeah, you can learn to become a brain surgeon. And the brain surgeon then develops the procedures to actually to do the surgery. Now, that's not procedural knowing in exactly the same way that tying your shoes. I hope my brain surgeon is very conscious when he enters into the structure. It's a recipe knowing, but in that kind of high level procedure, you're going to bring the highest level of your consciousness to try to do. But it is still the case that the brain surgeon is going to try to create an algorithmic procedure from the beginning of the operation down to the end. Okay. So John's getting that procedure. To give another example that's very useful for me, many of my doc students want to turn psychotherapy into procedural knowledge. Okay. What do I do, Greg? This person's pain. Tell me what I do so I know he had a good session. They're better and I filled my role. I want my checklist of do this, do this, do this, say this the right way. Psychotherapy is much more participatory knowledge. Okay. My brain surgeon, I don't really, but whatever, get me under, do it right. I'm not relating to you. Okay. But when I come to you, my ensoulment, to use the Zach Stein term, of relating and who I am and how I'm going to dance with you in this world, well, my identity and your identity are now going to come together, and our identities in this agent arena relationship need to make something new, okay, for you to feel like a real person, okay? You may want procedural knowledge on one hand, but if I just say, well, Phyllis, all of us are robots, and as long as you do 3, 2, 1, you will be totally happy. If was that really true? You'd be like, that sucks. I don't want to even do that because I'm not a robot. I feel participatory in the world, okay? So John's giving us a very rich vocabulary. He's using it in the cognitive educational sense many times. It does translate to the architecture, but when you do, you need to know you're going to make a rotation. And when you do that, you do come right down into reflexes, and procedural knowledge that becomes unconscious or automatic is essentially chained reflexes together that create a stimulus and create an outcome. Well, it's triggered by a stimulus that then results in an outcome.
Thank you so much.
Valuing it's always good to remember the sort of the value and the importance of semiotics.
Right.
Right. Yeah, we had a session on Ken's paper on integral semiotics, and just sort of really trying to identify and really see where are we coming from when we're talking about what, from which stage, and in what context, and all of that is so important.
It is so important.
All right, thanks again. So I thought to ask you, Dr. Henriques, maybe to go a little bit out on a limb. So with your work and other, and I say this in a very affectionate way, other galaxy brain people like yourself and Vervaeke and Wilbur, these big system metasystemic thinkers, so offering so much awesomeness in so many ways. So what do you anticipate, like where in your modeling, take it a generation from now, where are people going to pick up your work, Wilbur's work, Vervaeke's work? Like, what are the gaps they're going to fill in? What are the new emergent surprises? Like, where are the juicy hotspots that bring a next unfolding if it orients towards this, a more integrative kind of experience? Like, where do you think are the other pieces you're really curious, like how people run with what the work you're doing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. You know, that is an area I don't have great answers to. I'm definitely a better theorist than I am marketer and futurist. It's like, I was like, hey, I can think about this stuff. And then how to metabolize it. When I talk to people, I think I can share it pretty well. How do I actually structure it? And then how do I structure it into a system where other people, other communities can learn it, and then it can grow and evolve in a dynamic way? I have not been really successful at that. There are a lot of reasons for that. I'm not really being hard on myself here. I'm not great at it. It is an interesting process, and I don't think like that. Okay, but in order for me to hand it to people and have it be digestible, and then have it be turned into a community and grow in the way you think, it sort of needs to. That's the way a system will metabolize it, and I see this as a big next step for this. I really have identified this decade to how do I sync up. What is UTOK's note that it's playing towards this third attractor? Sometimes you hear the word third attractor, which is sort of like, okay, we're either going to global civilization collapse chaotically, or we'll return to a totalitarian state or generate a totalitarian state in reaction to that. Those are the two attractors. We want a more optimal, realistic one. UTOK certainly has a logos role to play in that, and it specifies key aspects of the meta-psych tech structure. And indeed, it really is, the architecture of it is really like, well, ideally, here's your ideal architecture for science and theology that's grounded in naturalism and is open to spirituality, it's agnostic about the ultimate universe and blah, blah, blah. This is a great, design. Now, what to do with that, because it is a galaxy in and of itself, I call it a labyrinth, how people adjust it. It's a freaking cartoon of a garden, people. This will not be the thing that goes to TikTok, okay? Somehow we actually got to metabolize that and get it in the next generation. I don't know. I'm not great at that. I'm super excited about the syncing up. I will announce here, it's in the works, but in March, we're going to have a conference. John will be the keynote. I've already identified 35 people that are willing to give talks. March 17th to 18th will be in talk. It's called Consilience, Unifying Knowledge and Orienting Toward Wisdom. And what I'm going to try to do there is create a logos hub, whereby my basic argument is get people on the right page about the Enlightenment gap. And John's very clear about the problem in cognitive science. I'm very clear about the problem in psychology. Listen, we have a logos opportunity here to get in right relation to our grammar and start talking about the world. And then what I was talking with Peter Lindbergh at the STOA, and he may, nothing's solidified yet, so I'm jumping ahead, folks, sorry, but anyway, I just was having this conversation to build a Wisdom Commons session where artists and other individuals are then taking this. I'm also working with Rich Blundell, who's bridging between scientists and artists. So this is a really excellent set of questions. I have no idea what's going to emerge. This is the on-the-ground empirical trial, error, exploration, embodiment, and then we'll see what sticks and grows. Hopefully stuff will. I'm not trying to avoid the question, it's just that it's really fuzzy when I look out on the horizon. I think that's Stephanie's got a question.
Okay, so my question, it's everything and nothing. Where does intuition sit within your framework?
Sure. Well, okay. So first off, so the framework basically says at the level of mentation, okay, you live inside of an organism and then you're inside of an animal, okay, and all of your experiences, which I would call mind two, so anything that you actually have access to is mind two. There's a layering of mind two, and mind two somehow, and we can talk about this, one of the great mysteries is exactly, somehow mind two is coming out of the field of mind one. Okay, so in other words, you have a non-conscious cognitive structure. And that's just look at yourself all of a sudden. I mean, I don't like, how do I think about John Vervaeke? You tell me, you say the word John Vervaeke, and I say, I just have access to the John Vervaeke file, right? And then I'm just presented with John Vervaeke, and for some reason I can understand what John's saying and we can sync up and blah, blah, blah. I listen to other people, I don't understand what they're saying. You ask me how I do that, and I don't know how I do that at all. My system is just presented with that, okay? The island, what you're really sitting on in your consciousness is an island of awareness, experiential awareness, then has conscious access that then has a line to a self-conscious justifier, okay? All of that sits in a field structure that is giving rise to it at one level, okay? It's an iterative process, it's a fascinating thing. But if you use the metaphor of the stage, you have a spotlight on a stage, and then there's all this backdrop, okay? Everything that was popped on it is from the backstage originally. So our entire experience of being in the world is we're thrown into the world by intuition or whatever it is that is the power of the mind. And then the mind is tossing ideas to us. The unconscious mind is constantly tossing ideas to us that we have really no idea where and how they come from. Okay, they're outside of our. Now we can wonder about this, and there's a lot of good stuff on creativity I could point you to, and John, of course, is an expert in many of these kinds of elements. But at the level of what is intuition, people have asked me that a lot. I'm like, well, almost everything. Okay, in the sense that what you are is a little island of awareness, conscious access, and justification on a sea of unconscious structure that is constantly affording you your awareness that you're thrown into. The whole structure is the intuition is behind it. Here's another thing I will say. People have done some interesting studies on the conscious contents, okay, of your subjective experiences. Actually, psychologists started here with Wilhelm Wundt, and then they totally got rid of looking at the inner experience of being. And now some psychologists have picked it back up. And one guy in particular mapped what he called pristine inner experiences, okay? What he did was he took a diary study, and he gets a little alarm like on your watch, and then a little alarm would go off, and they back you up 3 seconds, and he would say, what was on your mind 3 seconds ago? So he had people jot down, okay? And then he found that there were 5 different classifications, okay, of experience, okay, that people could identify with. 4 of them are pretty straightforward, okay? One is sensory motor outside stuff, like, I was looking at a cup, okay? One is sensory motor inside stuff, like I was feeling hungry, okay, feeling sad. One was perspectival thinking, basically, like I was imagining stuff in my head. And another was narrating. I was talking to myself, okay? But when he found a couple of things really, so that's all like, yeah, that's pretty consistent. Another thing that he found was unsymbolized thought, which people couldn't tell you how they were thinking about it, okay? But they knew they were thinking about it. So the example I gave to myself, because I was like, what is that? And then I was on a walk. I was on a walk one day, and I'd read this really interesting argument about justice. And I was just wandering around thinking about it. And then I had this thought. I was like, what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about justice, but how? Am I talking to myself? No. Am I justifying justice? No. Am I seeing images of justice? No. I'm just thinking about justice, but I can't tell you how I'm thinking about justice. Well, that's a good line, like that's your direct line to intuition. I'm sort of like playing around with no real experiential contact. It's like somehow my system's running it through, but it's not grounding it in the sensory motor or verbal narrative structure. It's like probably interfacing with the default mode network and other areas. It's fascinating. The last thing I'll say about that study, which is really interesting, and you may want to check this out, about 10% of people have very little verbal narration inside. Okay. So most of us, and I'm one of the 90%, regularly find themselves that they talk to each other. Okay. But a reliable finding of 10 to 15%, and I'm now checked with people. I found 3 people in my circle who actually, yeah, you all talk about that justification stuff. I don't do that. I mean, I can, but almost all of what they do is this sort of intuitive or picture-based thought, almost never talking to themselves privately. I find that to be, and you're like, huh, what a different, interesting experience of being in the world. I've almost never engaged in an internal dialogue, do it virtually all through intuitive, non-symbolic thought or picture-based thought. They can do it, but that's not a primary mode. That's about 10% of the population does that very rarely. I thought that was a fascinating finding.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you, Greg. I think maybe we can wind down. I'll ask maybe just a final question, unless someone else has a burning question. Scanning. Suzanne, you just unmuted yourself. Yeah.
Yes, I just an appreciation if we end up in mystery rather than in all that knowledge. As much as I appreciate, I really appreciated that Nomali introduced me yesterday and said, come to Dr. Henriques' talk. And yes, I'm glad I came.
I'm glad you did. Looks like Nina has a question.
Nina has a question, yes.
I have to unmute there. For those of us who are newbies to your theories, I see that, I can read your book, but what would you recommend as a next step to learn more? What do you think would be a good path for learning more and going deeper?
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. My next book will be coming out in November, so there's a second book on this. It's another academic.
Is it important to read the first one first?
No, not actually. No, okay. Both of them, because my real academic passion and expertise is on the problem of psychology. That is where I'm, and it's an extension of my argument. It really depends a little bit about what's going to come alive for you. Okay, so if you're a big picture thinker, I'm going to get you onto the tree of knowledge, get you into its connections in relationship to those things, and see how it offers a similar view of lots of people's, but then a unique and different view. If you're a mind scholar in the social sciences and in psychological sciences, I really want to help you orient towards the sort of how it explains, technical term, human mental behavior, which is what we're doing now, how people get together, and to understand justification, investment, influence dynamics in particular. And I can point you to some of those kinds of things. If you're interested in certain kinds of how does this help people? The stuff on ComMO and that kind of stuff. And then there's all these different podcasts that I've done on this corner of the internet, this kairotic moment in time, the stuff that I did with John on syncing up for a new vision of psychological / cognitive science and what does it mean. So those series there, I can certainly reply back. I was going to give the slides to Nomali. I'll give some pathways and the sad truth is I produce a lot of stuff. One of my goals in this next year is to really organize that and be better prepared to answer that question with I sort of know, but I need to onboard people into my system. So I need to build this. But in a note to Suzanne, that's just really a mystery to me, and I don't know how to do it. And there's a lot of ignorance and a lot of uncertainty what the future will hold, and I don't know. So yeah, I certainly appreciate that, and I do live in an enormous amount of awe and mystery. But the sad thing, I do think that we need knowledge, to ground us, and then to appreciate the awe of the mystery. People think, oh, your unified theory of knowledge is another thing. I'll just say real fast right away up. It's like, oh, so you solved all the problems. No. Okay. The best way to think about this, and my father was a professor. I come from a pretty long line of pretty critical analytic thinkers. Okay. So I've been sharpened on this. My sharp analytic view is we are clueless, and UTOK gives us a clue. Okay, that's basically where I really am in relationship to knowledge. This is getting an actual clue to frame our understanding, which we are void of. So I'm not saying this is done. This is the actual beginning of a coherent understanding, not the end of one. So the jump is complete incoherence to actual outline of a genuine potential for coherence to start genuine understanding down the road. So that's really where I am. And there's an endless number. Like, I don't know what dark energy is. I really don't know how mind one and mind two interface. I can go on and on and on about all this stuff. And I don't know about God. I love the concept of God, and maybe she loves me back. I don't know. I've learned a lot from Ken. I'm not quite over there in a full-fledged believing ontology of that kind of stuff, but I love it. It's beautiful. It orients me towards the transcendent. I can get behind that.
Thank you. That's awesome. And thank you for saying, I don't know what God is, because I keep saying that myself. When you don't grow up in the grammar of God, I grew up in Sri Lanka. And so like often there's all this God talk comes up, and then I'm sort of trying to navigate my way through that, but it typically just sort of goes over my head. But so
I'll say one last thing, Nomali, because I feel this whole system was set brilliantly by you. I felt really validated. You gave about as good an overview, engaging overview. So I'm going to talk to you after this at some point. You gave about as engaging, clear overview of my stuff that I have seen. So I've also seen, known, validated, and a bit awed by how well that was. Like, oh, I could have done that rather than 64 slides with hyper, I was like, make it playful and engaging. So I learned and was loved that. So I just need to say that. Well, maybe people can help me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad. Sometimes I just tell myself, just become like an 8-year-old, Nomali, and like see how you might understand, because actually I am an 8-year-old still, really. Anyways,
Love it.
So I think one of the tough things, Dragpa was talking earlier about the sort of the big thinkers of our time, like you and Wilbur and Vervaeke and Suzanne and Rowley, by the way, who's here on our call, wrote a book on integral Christianity. Dragpa is working on writing a book on Vajrayana Buddhism and integral, and how some of those things are meeting. So there's just a lot of incredible thinkers all over us. And you're trying to unify psychology in a sense. It's like one of your big projects. And when you offered those different interpretations of what mind means, for example, or what psychology means, for example, from an integral perspective, what I have come to see is that, or from a developmental perspective, what I have come to see is that not everybody is going to get behind you in your intention to bring coherence. And developmentally, that makes sense in the sense that the neurocognitive aspect of science is explained perhaps by a certain stage of development. The more sensitive Rogerian view is perhaps approached by a certain other level of development, post-modernity, for example. So how do you envision getting more people to embrace your kinds of teachings when the sort of the joint point of stuckness in some ways is developmental? Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes total sense. And I'm just in the process of really learning and engaging that, and really have been since 2020, essentially. So what I mean by that is, I fell into the rabbit hole. I thought I would be engaged in a normal academic enterprise, that I had made some theoretical insights. I grew up in Beck, under Beck and inside of the normal tradition. I could do empirical research, but I am a theorist. I thought I made a theoretical discovery, and I thought that people would care about that in psychology. It turns out, no, they don't. And then I had to learn about why, and then I had to learn about that structure. Although while I was super lucky. I got a day job as a professor in this combined integrated program, so I could be around people whereby the jump was not theory to empirical research, which I'm fine with, but that's just not what I like to do. It was theory to practice, and theory to community and an embodied ecological structure. Okay. And I, for 12 years, I've directed the program, and it basically is a test of ecological validity. Does this thing work in training integrative health service psychologists to go out and be leaders in the world? And the answer is yeah, it did. I led it for 12 years as director. I think over that track record, my track record is very cool. Very interestingly, I stepped off, and within 2 years, we had a mean green machine in our hands, interestingly. Okay. Which I was holding it. I would reading the post-Trump thing. I was like, oh, I'm holding an integral dialectic here that I wouldn't have put it in those language, but man, that's exactly what it was. And I left, and then I came back from a semester and was like, we're like, the literal fight, folks, was I was sharing with, well, one of the fights, I'm sharing my folks, hey, we should watch Jordan Peterson. Okay. And not supporting him. He's more conservative than I am. Well, I think it's fast. But the fact that I was pointing and saying we should pay attention was enough to say I'm a conservative old white man who's attending to evil power mongers. Okay. And my whole thing was, if that's where you are a moralizing road to hell. And so we're like, really have like, no, you actually failed my test. So I don't think you should be doctoral level psychologist, really. If you think that we can't even listen to this conversation, how can we be doctoral level psychologists? I mean, it's not like he's spouting Nazism, folks. I mean, come on. Well, it was boom, big problem. Okay. So to get back to your issue, now I sort of did it that way. And now with the garden and then Jordan Peterson, I'm not a part of the academy anymore. I'm like, this system and my vision is so different. They're so built on the old structure and developmentally and so entrenched in a particular worldview and way of operating that I'm like outside. But in 2011, my first book is like, I'm playing nice with psychology. Okay. You're missing an underlying theoretical architecture that can weave the schools together and yield a coherent picture. And we can now build our empirical structures around this and we'll play nice. Okay. My current book, psychology's fucked. Sorry. But the structure is broken. It's operative in a particular kind of way that is deeply problematic.
I think we may have lost Gregg.
Do that.
We just lost you, whatever you were
sorry.
saying in the last minute or so, Gregg. Sorry.
Yeah, I've seen it is my connection. I'm sorry. But basically, I solved the problem, and then there was a glitch. No. Basically, I don't know. We have to get together. We have to try things. We have to build theory to research to practice kinds of notions. This is the great learning decade for me to do this. I have my theory. I now need to change my frame into embodied growth practice. I've snuck in the comment about the theory of the week that I mentioned. And that's, in fact, I call this little place here the UTOK monastery of all. I never would have thought that, but it's like we're trying to figure out how to live this in the world. So to me, that's a great new experiment. I have no idea how that's going to go. They're trying lots of different things, hooking up with people. Right now, we've had a lot of beautiful conversations. Can we actually leverage this to make a growth generative function change? A lot of people are asking that. I'm not really the right person. I'm happy to cheer on. I'm happy to be a part of it. My wheelhouse is theory and clinical work, and other people's wheelhouses are different. And I need to know what my limitations are in relation. So I can offer logos analysis. I can offer, kind of human relatedness analysis from psychotherapy. And then we have to network together to weave this thing as a whole from many, many different threads.
Well, thank you so much. I hope that maybe we'll come back together. But thank you, everyone. I think we'll close here, and we hope to see you again another time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gregg.
Hey, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank
very
you.
much. Very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.